We have a really wonderful program for you this afternoon by a very special author who also happens to be editor-at-large at Vanity Fair magazine, Cullen Murphy. From the 1950s through the 1990s, Fairfield County, Connecticut was home to many of America's best cartoonists and illustrators. The men responsible in the county, Fairfield County, for Beetle Bailey, Little Orphan Annie, Hagar the Horrible, and countless other comic strips created a kind of remarkable creative community. And of course, at the center of this was John Cullen Murphy, our presenter's father. And Cullen Murphy has written a very well-received book called Cartoon County, My Father and His Friends in the Golden Age of Make-Believe. And of course, at the center of this was John Cullen Murphy, who for years actually created drawings for Prince Valiant and for Big Ben Bolt, if you remember those. And in addition to being a very talented artist, John Cullen Murphy was also a neighbor and a model for Norman Rockwell in New Rochelle, New York. So Cullen grew up in New Rochelle, and Rockwell and John Cullen Murphy developed a great friendship when Rockwell was at the beginning of his career. To give you a little background on Cullen Murphy, our speaker today, Cullen is an accomplished writer and editor, and as I said, editor-at-large at Vanity Fair magazine. He served as managing editor at The Atlantic from 1985 to 2006. And he is the author of several acclaimed books, including The Word According to Eve, Women and the Bible in Ancient Times and Our Own, and Are We Rome, which compares the politics and culture of ancient Rome with that of the contemporary United States. He's also the author of God's Jury, The Inquisition, and the Making of the Modern World. And he has also written many storylines for Prince Valiant, which his father also illustrated, and he'll tell you a lot more about that. But we do have his beautiful book upstairs. It's available for signing and personalizing, and we know it would make a great holiday gift. So we're very happy you're all here, and welcome to Cullen Murphy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thanks to all of you for braving the weather. And Stephanie, thank you for giving the synopsis of my book, which I was going to do, and I'm glad to have time to spare and not do that. Just in a nutshell, as Stephanie indicated, the book is about my father, and it's about this group of cartoonists. And so it's very much a memoir. It's seen through my eyes. This is the world I grew up in. I actually grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut. I lived there all my life until going off to school, as did my family and those scores and scores of other cartoonists. And the publisher has reproduced about 150 images. It's in full color throughout. They've done an extraordinary job, and I couldn't be more pleased to have this testimonial to my father and to that world which has essentially vanished now. So I'm going to talk for about a half an hour, and I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions from all of you. And this is going to be kind of an idiosyncratic talk. I'm not going to try to give you everything that's in the book, but I want to hit some things that are important to me and important to this institution. Also, I love this museum. I come here frequently. And so let me start with this man. Now that is my father. He's 22 years old, and it's a self-portrait by him. So as you can see, he became a pretty accomplished artist at a very young age. I don't think he was ever really as self-confident as he looks there, and or as arrogant. I think it's a 22-year-old trying to look serious, and he's looking in a mirror, so everything is reversed, the way the coat is. But you can tell very early on that this fellow knows what he is doing. He doesn't quite know enough about what he's doing, but he knows quite a bit. Now, an important point is, I never actually knew that man. This portrait was painted 10 years before I was born. By the time I came of age, there was a different sort of fellow around the house. He looked like this. He didn't always look like this, but he frequently looked something like this. Or he looked, like that. Because, like Rockwell, like many other artists, he had to draw many, many human figures in the comic strips that he did. He did 2 of them. For the first part of his career, it was a strip about a prize fighter, and it was named Big Ben Bolt. Ben Bolt was an Ivy League educated heavyweight champion. They're a dime a dozen, and lived with an impoverished aunt and uncle on Beacon Hill, and he did that for 20 years or so, and then he took over the drawing of Prince Valiant from Hal Foster. And a little bit after that, in 1980, I took over the writing of the strip. So my father and I worked on it for about 25 years until his death in 2004. I did all the writing, and he did all the artwork. In the course of his career doing comic strips, leaving everything else aside, the portraits, the sketches, he probably drew 200,000 human figures in newspapers. I didn't count them all. I did a kind of back-of-the-envelope math. It's a lot of figures. And when you're doing something like that, it's really helpful to be able to use yourself as a model. And he was a great model. Going back to that portrait that we saw, he really was his own best model. And he exaggerated himself, his poses. His laughter was more than just normal human laughter, and his sadness made you want to run from the room. I have thousands and thousands of these photographs. There's probably not a documentary photographic record of any human being on Earth doing something so stupid for a period so long, for 55 years, from basically the time he gets out of the Army until just a few weeks before his death. It's a wonderful thing to have. Lord only knows what we're ever going to do with it. Now, to Fairfield County. My father was not alone in this lifestyle. As I mentioned, many illustrators had been taking pictures of themselves, and we were living in the middle of this group of cartoonists who had come to Fairfield County for a variety of reasons. There were a few pioneers who'd come in the late 40s. Land was cheap. You don't think of Greenwich land being cheap nowadays. It was cheap in 1947. It was cheap in 1955, cheaper than New Rochelle. Connecticut did not have an income tax. That was a plus. And it was only an hour from New York by train. You had to be close to New York because that's where the publishers were. That's where the syndicates were. That's where the magazines were when you went door to door selling your work if you were a gag cartoonist. So for all these reasons, cartoonists began flocking out to Fairfield County, and this drawing was done by Mort Walker and Jerry Dumas in the mid-1960s. They wanted to just show Fairfield County with all the cartoonists in it, so you can see the names of different cartoonists, but they ran out of room. That's probably a quarter of the cartoonists who lived there. And these are the people who did, I'm not going to name them all, but just to give you the flavor, Popeye, Beetle Bailey, High and Lois, Joe Palooka, Little Orphan Annie, Snuffy Smith, Superman, Blondie, On Stage, Rip Kirby, Juliet Jones, Hagar the Horrible, Henry, Barnaby, Big Ben Bolt. Not to mention about 20 or so New Yorker cartoonists. So it was quite a community. People tended to know each other. They socialized with each other. They drank together. They drank too much together, and they golfed together. They bowled together. Their families knew one another, and it was a bohemian subculture in the midst of the land of the gray flannel suit. To me, it seemed normal. The gray flannel suit seemed odd, and all those people on the train station with their briefcases going into New York, those thousands and thousands of people were the outliers, whereas the 150 people I knew were the the salt of the earth, this is what it's like to be a human being in the 20th century types. Of course, I was not correct about that. As you would expect, they were sometimes an odd bunch. Here's one of them, Ernie Bushmiller. He's the man, who drew Nancy. And I don't know what, I've been trying to figure out what was going on here. It was some sort of promotional event for some sort of swimsuit. And, this was the day when, if you could get a cartoonist to endorse your swimsuit, as opposed to an Olympic star, it meant something. So Ernie Bushmiller did Nancy, a strip that's many people don't get, which has therefore attracted a great deal of academic interest. And Ernie Bushmiller would always say his motto was "dumb it down." Some of us agreed that he'd been successful in that. But it has become a real target for, for some professors of English or popular culture, because it is so stripped down, so elemental, that people figure this must be deep. So Ernie Bushmiller would have given you an argument, but the professors probably know better. So let me spend a little bit of time with some of the folks who were closest to my father. This is, clearly not a man in a gray flannel suit. This is Mort Walker, who did Beetle Bailey. And Mort not only did that, but he also created High and Lois. He did Boner's Ark, many other strips. He was a real entrepreneur. The cartoonists are a group of people who have virtually no business sense whatsoever. I think if you take artists in general, for every Titian who has a real business sense, there are 100 who have no business sense whatsoever. So Mort is the Titian of this group, and he had many strips. He was very, very successful. But as you can see, he had his nutty side. And in the slide I'm about to show you, there's another side to him, which was something that I think every cartoonist shared, which was this ability to create reality out of unreality. Essentially, you're living in an unreal world. You're creating things that are not real. In an odd way, they sometimes become real. So this is, if you look at cartoons, you'll notice that there are certain conventions. If somebody's working hard, there are beads of sweat that come off their heads. Or if you've got a warm pie, you've got a little squiggle coming off the top to show that it's hot. And so do these things have names? Of course they don't have names, but Mort decided he would give them all names. So you can see, a waftaram is the wavy aroma coming off a pie. And ploods are those beads of sweat. Now this is all made up out of whole cloth. It was just Mort deciding one day, here's a reality in search of, fake names. But by now they've all become real. If you Google these words, you'll find it, people taking it very seriously. Ploods, oh yes, it's those drops of sweat. But it's a word that's really only about 40 years old. Another thing that Mort did is that he kind of had a private stock of cartoons that were never meant to see the light of day. And these have all been, this is just one example of many. In the age of the graphic novel, he could publish these things, but not in the age of the mass circulation daily newspaper. They've been published in Sweden. Literally, they've been published in Sweden. Dick Brown, with his most important creation, his most important creation is Dick, I think, but his other one is Hagar the Horrible. Dick was a great guy, beloved of children. He had this ursine look, as you can see. He was disheveled. People used to say about the writer Haywood Broun that he looked like an unmade bed, and there's a cartoonist friend of ours said that Dick looked like an unmade Haywood Broun. And he had started drawing for newspapers before the war, like a lot of cartoonists, was in the Army during World War II. They put him to work drawing maps, which was like the worst assignment for Dick, who could barely find the stairs in his house. But he was a pretty accomplished cartoonist even then, during the war. One of the first jobs he got was to do a series of posters for, warning against the dangers of venereal disease, and that was this guy, whose name was, Dick was a funny guy. His name was Willie Get It. And anyway, people often ask about how cartoonists get ideas, and every cartoonist has different ways of getting ideas. Mort typically had a kind of like an agribusiness type system. It was really well thought out. And Dick typically had nothing like that. He would say that the most helpful thing to him was to put a black dot on a white piece of paper and stare at it, and ideas would come. Somehow ideas came. There were other techniques. Sometimes they looked a lot like sleeping, and or they could look like putting in your studio. Sometimes they came with such force that it's really astonishing. And this is, I'm about to show you an example of something by a man named Otto Saglo, who did The Little King. And he didn't live in Fairfield County. He was a New Yorker. But he was a friend of my dad's. I met him many times. He was about this tall, and he studied with John Sloan and other Ashcan school folks, and then took this turn into doing cartoons. But so here's one. It's the classic manhole cartoon. Clearly two men down below talking, and the only illustration you see is the ladder coming out of the manhole and the suggestion, and the caption is really doing the work. In the late 1920s, Otto Saglo published this same drawing in the New Yorker 30 times, with the only thing changing was the caption. It might be something like, well, you see, she's an extrovert and I'm an introvert, and that was all that changed. And it's such a wonderful conceit. In a way, it prefigures what the New Yorker does now on their last page, asking people to come up with the captions. Stan Drake. Stan Drake did a strip called The Heart of Juliet Jones, which was never a favorite of mine because it was a romantic melodrama, and this was not something a 12-year-old was really drawn to. But look at his drawing. It is really sensational. He loved drawing women. He had learned to draw, or perfected his style by just copying publicity stills from Hollywood in the late 1940s. He's one of the most stylish of all the cartoonists, and a great friend to our family. When my father had pneumonia in the early 60s and was in an oxygen tent, if people remember what oxygen tents are, and Stan did his strip Big Ben Bolt for a period of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. That capacity of cartoonists to mimic the styles of others was highly developed, and they were doing this sort of thing all the time for one another. Stan was a great believer in technology. He was the first person I knew who had an electric eraser, and at the time people would just sort of mutter darkly, can you believe what Stan has done? He's bought an electric eraser. And then within about 6 months, everybody had an electric eraser. But his technology went in other directions. So, for instance, the Xerox machine. What if, instead of doing the New York City skyline, spending hours and hours painting inking the buildings and leaving all those windows lit, what if you took a Xerox machine and put it on high contrast and got the skyline and then pasted it down as a panel? Wouldn't this save you an awful lot of time? And so there, for instance. This is a technique called, the jargon term is talking building. And that in itself saves time. When you don't have to do figures, you can just put the buildings down and then have the speech balloon coming out of the building. And anyway, Stan, in a pinch, loved talking buildings. And then finally, Chuck Saxon, New Yorker cartoonist, a man who, in his lifetime, I think did something like 85 covers and 800 cartoons for the New Yorker. He really defined a lot of what the New Yorker was about visually. I love the grace of his line. It's so fluid, and what you wouldn't know is that he probably threw away 20 of those before he found the one that worked for him. And I'm lucky enough to have a few of the ones that he threw away, because who can tell the difference? Something was wrong with them, and but only he knew what it was. But Chuck he had a fertile imagination. He was very funny. There are memorable New Yorker cartoons that have stuck in my mind. There's one where a bunch of people are sitting around a boardroom, and the chairman of the board says to them all, "Honesty is one of the better policies." And Chuck had this unerring feel for dialogue, for the way people talk in kind of the most affluent reaches of suburbia. He had a heart attack, fatal heart attack, and his last words I've always felt it could have been a Chuck Saxon cartoon. So he had a heart attack, he fell, knocked over a table in the living room. His wife called the EMTs, they came. He's in very bad shape. He's being carried out. And he says to his wife as they go out the front door, "Honey, I guess I'd better die. I just broke our best lamp." So, now, the world in which these people lived, this is a Prince Valiant page from around 1960. And many of you probably remember, but lots of younger people don't really have a memory at all of the position that comic strips had. What a pop cultural phenomenon they were, how important they were. This is taken from a 16-page supplement, which was, at the time, normal in 1960. It was Puck, the Comics Weekly. There were about 50 square feet of comics there. It was the size of a newspaper broadsheet, so, basically you take the New York Times. Actually, the New York Times was bigger back then. And that's what comics were. And the rest of the newspaper was wrapped in the comics on a Sunday. It wasn't like Hiroshima Destroyed is wrapped around the comics. It's the other way around, because the comics are more important from a sales point of view. And so, because of the amount of space, because of how good the color was, it was natural that people would gravitate to this as a medium, just as it's natural today, I think, for people to gravitate to graphic novels. In terms of the business, this was run by newspapers and newspaper syndicates. This business model had started around the turn of the century. Here's a very early look at what a bullpen at a syndicate looked like. And this is about 100 years ago, New York Journal. And the bullpen is the place where all the comics come into at the syndicate, all the originals. And these are the folks who, hard as it is to believe, correct the spelling, censor the bad jokes, the things that can't go into a family newspaper. The fellow in the boater hat happens to be Winsor McCay, the creator of Little Nemo in Slumberland. Some version of this scene, slightly more civilized, slightly more modern, existed for really 100 years. And I remember going into the bullpen at King Features many, many times. One of the jobs was censorship, and including really inane forms of censorship, like, tobacco was a problem. So, there's the original on the left, and there's what the subtle people in the bullpen did with it. But King Features had a list of, as Ernie Bushmiller remembered, what he called 35 no's, things you couldn't do. You couldn't show dirty socks on a chair. Nobody understands why that was a prohibition, but you couldn't. You couldn't show male nipples, and this was a real problem. If you had a strip about a caveman, for instance, or a prize fighter, as my father did. All the Big Ben Bolts, when he's fighting in his championship rounds, he's handicapped by the lack of nipples. And now I mentioned that the attractiveness of the comic world, just the compelling power of what those pages look like. And my father had started off wanting to be an illustrator, and in fact he always regarded himself as an illustrator, and because of the kinds of strips he did, he was able to work as an illustrator. Let's go back a little bit to his own youth. So that's him. And in 1935, he's 16 years old, and as Stephanie mentioned, he lived 2 doors down from Norman Rockwell in New Rochelle on Lord Kitchener Road. And so Rockwell had seen him playing baseball. He had a shock of red hair, like every Rockwell-esque kid you've ever seen. Asked his mom if young Jack could pose, and so he began posing for him, but he also began learning from him. My father was bent on being an artist already. This was a great opportunity. Even a 15-year-old could see that, and he spent a lot of time with Rockwell. This is by Norman Rockwell, and it was done for my dad. So what Rockwell used to do was give my father Hemingway short stories to illustrate, like The Killers, and say, you go off, it's probably just to get him out of the studio, you go off and illustrate this. And my father would come back with his own sketches, and then Rockwell would say, well, that isn't quite right. Why don't you do it this way? So this is an example of the why don't you do it this way in terms of composition. And my father was a dutiful person, and he did it that way. That's the painting that he did, and he was 16 years old when he did that. We have a lot of my father's work because he saved everything from this young period, and a lot of it has little drawings by Rockwell in the margins saying, that's not a hand. This is what a hand looks like when it's doing this, and or an eye, things like that. Also living in New Rochelle at the time was J.C. Leyendecker. I remember it was a wonderful exhibition here of Leyendecker's work, and there was a yard sale at Leyendecker's once. My father went over and picked up 20 oil sketches by J.C. Leyendecker, all little things about that size. Like that, for instance. Just a beautiful piece of work. There might be a nose or an ear, or a hand that's gesticulating. That's all these things were. Things that Leyendecker was throwing away. It's a reminder. My father always said that he liked unfinished work better than finished work, and from every time I go to a exhibit of some sort and see the various stages of people's work, that always comes to mind somehow when you're allowed to look behind and see what led up to the final product. He couldn't help himself. He drew everywhere. These are letters home from the war, and there are 800 of these letters, many of them with sketches. The war was an eye-opening experience for him because he was used as an artist. He was on General MacArthur's staff. And so he explored oil painting and watercolors and pen and ink with watercolor washes and caricature and portraiture. All the things that he would do for the rest of his life. But when you look at the stuff that he did during the war, you begin to see how he really pushed in every direction. There's one point, he's in New Guinea. I mean, I can't, when I read his letters, I've read them all, and he gave me his diaries. I can't believe what's on his mind. He's in the middle of New Guinea. He's with MacArthur. It's a terrible time in the war. You know, people are dying right and left, and he's there in some hut, coming up with ideas for the New Yorker. In this one, what it shows is there's a bunch of Jeeps going one direction, and it has models from Broadway shows and a theatrical agent. They're coming to do some kind of USO show. And then in the other direction, it's all the soldiers marching the other direction from battle, looking at the cavalcade going in the other direction. Now, I mean, he never did that, but he's always thinking about what's going on back home. This is the room. It was done shortly after MacArthur met with Hirohito, that famous meeting when Hirohito supposedly said, "You can have my head, but save my country," and MacArthur said, "No, we don't have to go that far." You know, there are great famous photographs of Hirohito in his morning suit, and MacArthur in his tan uniform. Anyway, my father went into the room right afterwards and did that pencil sketch for what was going to be a painting that he never did. But again, the unfinished work in some ways is just as interesting. It's all labeled with colors, and many artists work this way. One of the things that my father picked up from Rockwell was just how to use models, and also the photography aspect. Using it, you can use live models or you can use photographs. And as we all know, the bottom is Rockwell and a very famous painting. The top is Maxfield Parrish, who did the same thing. This is an earlier guy, Edward Linley Sanborn, who was a cartoonist for Punch. He's one of the earliest people who would dress up and take pictures of himself. And of course my father, there he is as some kind of noble knight. There he is more towards the end of his life. And there's almost nothing that he wouldn't do for the sake of the strip. From time to time, he'd be in the studio. That's his studio there. There'd be a knock on that door behind him. It'd be the plumber or the electrician just wanting a check or something. It's not a normal transaction. He had all of us children. I'm one of 8 children. I'm the oldest, and all of us are posed for these pictures, and all of us found our ways into the strips. There's me, looking about as happy as I was when the photograph was being taken, because my father could turn on laughter and charm and every other emotion in a second, and none of us children ever lived up to his ideal in that respect. This is one of the strips that my father and I did, just to come back to Prince Valiant, and we worked together for 25 years. It was really an extraordinary thing. So few people get to work with their parents any longer. Back in million BC, everybody worked with their parents. As recently as 100 or 150 years ago, probably a majority of people worked with their parents one way or another. Nowadays, not that many. And when you think about it, who is it? Royal families, people with family businesses, organized crime. There's not that many, but cartoonists is one group. And the children of Mort Walker work on his strips. The children of Dick Brown, for a time, worked on his strips. I worked on this with my father. My sister Meg did the coloring, and did all the lettering, which is an art form in itself. The strip had been created by Hal Foster. This is Hal. See the size that he's working on? It's enormous. And my father worked at something close to that size. These originals, just extraordinary works when you see the detail that is in them. Something that just can't be captured when it's reduced for a newspaper. And yet, it didn't stop the illustrator from giving the work his all. Hal was a wonderful fellow, a little bit laconic, could be funny in a dry way. As a child, I sort of thought of him as kind of God's Canadian younger brother. But he was an active person. He used to shoot deer from that window. Returning to that comment about how some of the things that he did just quickly are often more interesting than the finished works. He used to send my father sketches from time to time for how he thought a character should look. So this is just one of those. There literally are hundreds and hundreds of these that exist. And I happen to have, 20 or so. But that's just a sketch. My father had a very playful side too, and it butted up sometimes against his sense of dignity. And in a strip like Prince Valiant, that was a great field of play to have those two things come into conflict. There's a moment in the history of the strip when Prince Arn is finally getting married. He's getting married to a woman named Maeve, who was modeled on my wife. And I said to my father, this would be in the mid-'80s, I said to my father, well, if it's a royal wedding, maybe we should have recognizable people there. And he said, like who? And I said, well, Prince Charles, Prince Philip, Ronald Reagan, Nancy Reagan. And he said, great, let's do that. And he did it. And then the dignity thing came in. And he thought, no, I can't do that. This is a sacred moment in this extraordinary historical saga, and I'm going to make a joke out of it. I can't do that. So he put wimples on the women and beards on the men. But I think you can see Prince Charles there with the black hair, and then Prince Philip right above him, and then Ronald Reagan right above him, and Nancy Reagan. So that's him, and that's me. I want to end on this photograph for a particular reason. I love this photograph. We're together doing different things in the same place, and probably with something like the same motivation. He's posing for a picture. I don't need to be there. I just happen to be in his studio, so he didn't want to move me. I'm reading or writing something. Maybe I'm beginning to write the book. But when I see that picture, I'm always reminded of what an unusual circumstance it was to grow up in this kind of a household where you were making your own kind of life from scratch. You weren't looking out and saying, I see, here's a career path that I can see is very well defined. I know how to walk in those steps because everybody else has trod them before me. It wasn't like that at all. It was responding to something that was inside you. This is what I like to do. I'd like to see if I can live my life doing this. It may not be easy or straightforward or linear, but maybe I can make a go of it. And that's the attitude that you would have found in different ways among many different cartoonists. And it was a particular value system. Not that there's anything wrong with others. It was just the nature of the one that I grew up in. That was passed along to all of us children. My parents were not the kind of people who thought, I want you to go to this school, I want you to follow this path. It was, the questions that they asked were, what drives you? What do you enjoy? Where do you think you can bring your talents to the fullest? And figure that out and go after it. I don't think until I began work on this book that I fully appreciated that legacy that they had left us. But as I began to read my father's letters and diaries, as I spoke to the surviving friends, as I simply thought about the lives that they had lived, I could see how they shared that in common, and how important it was to the lives of all of us in the next generation, and how important it has been, in particular, for me. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.